Dumelang Bahlali, how are you guys doing? I hope you guys are doing great. We are going to be reviewing Mpoomy Ledwaba's book, How Did We Get Here? So as I read the book, I post like snippets of so there's a mini review that happens on my Instagram as I'm reading the book. So I will be referring to those the notes or the comments that I made whilst I was reading the book. I do have to put a disclaimer. I'm not an editor. I'm not a professional. I'm just somebody who is exercising their constitutional right to freedom of expression. The intention is not to tarnish, or I'm not a hater. I'm really not invested. So a little bit, some brief background. So I used to follow Mpoomy Ledwaba back then after she dropped out and she was still starting out, and I really used to love her content. And then at some point she just lost me as an audience, especially when she became a smag influencer, and then there was the Sexy Wives Club. It just felt like she was playing, for the auditorium. So I then, I don't know. Yeah, so I had my reservations about buying the book because I'm just like, I don't know how I feel about you, but I did have a list of things that I wanted to know, and what better way than to read the book. So the first few chapters of the book I do feel like are a bit underwhelming, and I will delve deeper into why I say that. It felt like she was being vulnerable, but not necessarily because she's being vulnerable and she's writing a book, but because she wanted the book to sell. So I wasn't impressed with the first 4 or 5 chapters, but as the book progresses, she does get a bit more vulnerable and it does feel a bit more authentic. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So like I said, I'm not here to start a smear campaign. I'm just a person who really loves reading, and I thought it would be fun. So let's get into it. Okay, cool. So firstly, I'm going to refer to the list that I made about what I'm looking forward to, and then we will see if she actually goes on to address these aspects, right? So I say on my Instagram, if the book does not address the following topics, then regrettably, the primary reason to purchase it would be to support a Black female-owned business. Firstly, I was looking forward to disagreements and fallouts with other influencers within the industry, particularly Yoel's channel. Like Mpoomy and Yoel's used to be like friendship goals, and then next thing they were not friends anymore. And I don't think Mpoomy or Yoel's have spoken about what happened. I remember Yoel's posted a video and she was talking about how people pretend to be Christian and hallelujah, but to the core of who they are, they're not good people. So I just assumed she was referring to Mpoomy, but obviously I don't know if that is true or not. Indications or insights that reflect challenges and moments of uncertainty, including Jolongo. So there's a chapter on somebody just sent me a very problematic text, so I got distracted. So there is a chapter where she speaks about problems within their marriage, and I thoroughly enjoyed it because I thought, oh my goodness, she's being genuine. She's revealing things that we did not know, so I really did appreciate that chapter. And then the concept of main character syndrome and personal experiences related to it, which some, including myself, have been accused of exhibiting. So I do think she does have main character syndrome. I've also been accused of having main character syndrome, and there's nothing wrong. I just feel like some people were born to lead, and I do think Mpoomy is a leader by nature, right? So I don't know, I just wanted her to dabble a little bit more into that, which she does. So I'm going to be going through the book, and then I'll also try and refer to comments that I made on my Instagram stories while I was reading the book. Sharp. So the first chapter is the elephant in the room, and in the first chapter she refers to her fallout with Bonolo Munaisa. I personally did not know they once fell off. I knew that Bonolo was working for Mpoomy at some point and she stopped, and I didn't think there was a story there. So apparently there was a story and she talks about it in the book. But for a first chapter, I don't know. I think the first chapter of a book bears a very heavy, obligation to sort of capture the reader. So you need to start with something very strong. And I think the real elephant in the room is her fallout with Yoel's channels, the demise of the Sexy Wives Club. Quite frankly, nobody cares about what happened between you and Bonolo because you guys are still friends, so there isn't really much tea there. But yeah, so I think the first chapter wasn't captivating enough, and she stands at risk of losing the reader fairly easier because she didn't choose to lead with like a controversial something that everybody is looking forward to. Okay, so let us get into it. Chapter 1 spoke about the elephant in the room and how I felt. It was slightly underwhelming for a first chapter. Now, obviously I don't have enough time, and I don't think you do either, to go through the whole book. So I'll just pick like interesting sections. So initially in the first few chapters, I wasn't making notes or putting sticky notes, so it's going to be very difficult to then remember what was spoken about. Then there's a chapter on feminism. Chapter 6, she says a feminist is born, right? So she then goes on to call herself a feminist. But then when she explains why she's a feminist, she speaks about things that Chimamanda speaks about in her we are all born to be, we should all be feminists. So as an avid reader, I wasn't really impressed because I'm like, you're telling me like I've read this before, So I think I would have appreciated if you're gonna call yourself a feminist, then detail your lived experience of what that has meant in your relationships, in your career, as opposed to just paraphrasing what somebody else has said in their books. But I do feel like Mpoomy was writing this book for her audience, the people that, follow her, not so much avid readers, because she uses like the term fam, gal pal. And as a reader, it annoyed me because I'm like, no, please, let's just appreciate the English language for what it was. So I do feel like the book was written for her followers, not so much avid readers. And I respect the strategy and the approach, but I think if you're gonna write a book, then at the back of your head, you need to try and impress, or you need to make an impression for people that read books. Because in as much as you're writing your first book, a lot of your followers are gonna buy it because they love you and they follow you. People that read books, if they're not impressed with your first book, they're not gonna buy the second book, And you need those people, because the people that don't read books, I can guarantee you now, they're not gonna buy another book. So I did feel like, okay, this book is written for her followers, not necessarily people that read. So when I started reading the book, I say, let us hear what our esteemed influencer has to share with the audience. A friend of mine holds significant reservations regarding individuals who write memoirs at the age of 30. I'm currently 10 pages in, and I must admit it has not been an effortless read. Nonetheless, I do believe she approached the writing process with some level of intention. So my reservations about people that are young writing memoirs is you still have a brand to maintain. So there was a lot of instances in the book where I felt like she could have went a little bit deeper, but because she has a brand to maintain, she can't really say much, At the end of the day, even after writing this book, she still has to make a living. So I think it was a bit premature. in the sense that ideally, if you're going to write a memoir, write it when you're old and you're about to kick the bucket because you don't have anything to lose. So hopefully you do write another one at a later stage in your life, and it will be a little bit more detailed and a little bit more, yeah. I'm 29 pages in, and she uses the word fam quite a lot, which I find somewhat off-putting. It reminds me of those, the N-word we grew up with in the hood, who wore baggy clothes and had an exaggerated attempt at an American accent. Like, I just felt like she was trying a little bit too hard to be cool. And people that read books don't read books so that you can be cool. They read books because they love literature. Hence, I say I feel like the book was written more so for her followers than it was avid readers. And then I made another comment. I say, as an author, the moment you recognize that those who invest their time and money in books highly appreciate the language of the colonizer, you liberate yourself from the constraints of trying to appease the masses. I would rather craft an exceptional book that appeals to the literally inclined than create one solely for commercial success. Right? Let's talk about that. So there's a lot of celebrities in South Africa who have written books. Okay, let me not mention people's names, but it feels like people in South Africa read books because they have a large audience and they know people are going to buy. But those books are terrible. They are terrible to read, So I think I would really appreciate like a reading culture in South Africa where people write books because they have something meaningful to say, not because you have a large audience and you feel let's make money. Okay, this is the initial phases of the book. I do then change my mind at some point in the book. I think I've been criticizing a lot, so let me just say, if you made it up to this point, I do think you should buy this book. I think it's a relatively good book for somebody who's a first-time author. You can continue listening to me, and please, guys, don't come for me. But don't come for me, man. It's meant to be fun and so this is what I say. I feel as though I've read this book before. It lacks originality. While Mpoomy does show a degree of vulnerability, it comes across as somewhat superficial. The first chapter discusses a fallout with Bonolo Monaisa, which in my opinion feels somewhat trivial for an opening chapter intended to captivate the reader. It seems as if her vulnerability is included out of necessity, as a tool to sell the story, rather than a profound and integral part of the narrative. So far, she has yet to demonstrate the kind of essential, impactful vulnerability that distinguishes truly great works. So this is the beginning chapters, guys. The book gets good, okay? So hang in there. We are now at chapter 11, I Quit. So in chapter 11, she's talking about a time when she was working at a very popular restaurant in South Africa, and then she experienced racism for the first time. So she says, they ate their entire meal, leaving their plates clean, and proceeded to ask for the manager. I can still smell the racism on them. My heart beats a little faster when I think of those 40 minutes I spent serving a couple who thought that I, a bright 16-year-old girl with a better twang than they had, belonged in the kitchen and at their mercy. After that incident, I promised myself that no white person would ever walk over me again. My mom and dad had made sure I always knew my value and my worth, and I no longer allow people to question it. I have a bit of a bull terrier living in me. He comes out when my worth is questioned. So this is the first note that I make in the book. I say, very interesting to see her openly engage about racism. So I used to follow Mpoomy back then. I follow her now again after reading her book, And she made a comment about blocking people that make weird comments about, race. And as wrong as it is, I feel like Black people have a tendency of just being funny like that, and it just felt like she was being a bit dramatic. So it's very interesting to see her openly talk about an incidence where she experienced racism. Alrighty, I need to say that, like, when I'm under pressure, sometimes my English bundles, they deplete. So if you're gonna come for my English bundles, darling, sorry, honey. Okay, cool. Okay, now the positive. Okay, so now we are on chapter 14. You can't Google cows. So she's basically talking about her and Brandon, Lobola, and all of that. And she goes into detail about where they were financially, and it was such a beautiful chapter to read. I made another comment. I say I loved how vulnerable and authentic she was about their finances. In this chapter, I didn't feel like she was trying to maintain a brand. Like, I genuinely felt like, oh my goodness, this is an author who is, detailing her lived experience. So this was one of my favorite chapters. Okay. Chapter 15, there's a highlight. Our early days of marriage were fun and somewhat naive. We took on the traditional roles of husband and wife. I gave up more of myself than I would have wanted to, while my husband did not. It was my job, as I saw it, to make his dreams come true and to allow the aim of my existence to be led by him. Guys, English bundles. I was deeply disappointed when I realized that he didn't see things that way, but the life we would create together would be ideal. So this is so powerful. Like, people are different, and I think we all have an idea of what marriage should look like. Like, I always say I don't consider myself marriage material because I don't see myself conforming to, the traditional narrative of what that should look like. And yeah, so in her book she speaks, like, I think when I was reading the book and like how she grew up, and so she does speak about her parents not being that financially well off, but there's certain things that she speaks about, you're like, darling, you were having lasagna, none of us were having that. So I struggled to reconcile the fact that the parents, were working really hard to make sure that they had a comfortable life. And it just sounded like a book, come on, some of the things like sleepovers, and I'm just like, my sister, what do you mean? So this is a note that I made. She was definitely privileged. Well, it sounded like that from reading the book. I definitely did not grow up eating lasagna. So it was slightly difficult for me to reconcile her poverty stories and some of the, detailing of how she grew up and. Okay, cool. So I made a note on my Instagram comments. I say I thoroughly enjoyed the chapter detailing her decision to leave university. And then I guess you guys can buy the book for chapter 10. So at this point in the book, I'm like, guys, you guys can buy the book, but just to read chapter 10, right? And then in the book, she says 3 more auditions, and I realized modeling wasn't for me. I was surrounded by better looking and more stylish people, which made me feel insecure. I do not believe in staying in places that make me question who I am. So that was the end of that. This is very powerful. I do not believe in staying in places that make me question who I am. I do not believe in staying in places that make me question who I am. So note that down. Next time you're in a space that makes you question who you are, then that should be your, your indicator for, okay, maybe it's time to skedaddle. Alrighty, now we are in chapter 17. I think here she's detailing either her first pregnancy or the second one. So I made another note. I say, vulnerability acknowledges feelings that might be frowned upon. Oh, I remember what this chapter was about. So Mpoomy has 2 kids, right? So in the book, she speaks about a third pregnancy, right? And she talks about how miserable she was and how she didn't want, the baby, da 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 da. So as a person who is Christian, because obviously, the general consensus is a child is a blessing from God. I appreciated how vulnerable and open she was about the fact that I wasn't too sure about keeping this baby. So Mpoomy currently has 2 kids. I'm not gonna spoil it. I'm not gonna spoil it for you guys, so you can buy the book and find out whether she terminated the pregnancy or whether. So this was also a very good chapter to read because she was so genuine and she was so authentic, and it's very difficult for people to then express things that might be frowned upon, because I can imagine there's some lady who's like a staunch Christian and like, yeah, wait, no, and then what. So kudos to you. I really, really did appreciate how vulnerable and vocal you were about like feelings that are uncomfortable. Like, it's very difficult for people to openly admit, actually, I hate my kids. Not that I'm saying she says she hates her kids, but I'm just saying, there are people out there who's like, oh my goodness, I don't think I should have been a mother. And for her to openly like disclose that she was pregnant and she didn't want to keep the pregnancy is commendable. Okay. So, backtrack. I make a comment on Instagram. I say, she just said I'm a feminist, and I have an inkling that it's about to be matata the problems. Because usually, like, feminism is a very tricky concept. So you don't just say you're a feminist. Like, there's layers to feminism. There's different theories. There's the evolution of feminism. So which, era do you identify with? So as soon as she said I'm a feminist, I'm like, it's about to go down. So this is what I say. So this is what she says in the book. I spend a lot of time studying the menu. Okay, no, that is not the part. Okay, so this is what I say.